I'm going to talk really about some semi-basic things and some things that aren't so basic in the context of just what we need for efficient crop production for corn and soybeans. And I'll focus, some of you may or may not be aware that, essentially in the end of 2014, beginning of 2015, we set out in terms of giving a comprehensive overview or assessment of our fertilizer recommendations tri-states. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that work and just kind of what that the implications for that. Okay. I'm going to try to keep this fairly brief, knowing it's kind of the end of the day, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. I know there's kind of a lot of questions in terms of fertilizer prices and grain prices and what that means. I'll try to address a little bit of those. I'm sure there'll be some others. So, all right. Well, suffice it to say that we'll start with the basics here, and that a fertilizer recommendation, or just understanding what's happening in the soil from an adaptive nutrient management perspective, really starts with the quality soil sample. And it just can't be underscored enough in terms of having some understanding of the basic concepts for taking something so simple as a soil sample and how to do that well, and the good practices associated with that. So we could talk plenty more about that, but I'll just, it's worth mentioning in my mind that a quality soil sample is really where a lot of this starts. And so consistency reigns, right? If you sample one way, come back 3 or 4 years later, sample to a different depth, do things differently, trying to compare and track what's happening over time becomes very challenging. And so, regardless of what we recommend, which is a 0 to 8 inch sample, and our recommendations are based on that, I believe more importantly than that is that you maintain consistency in terms of how things are sampled, preferably the lab that those samples are mailed to. That makes a little bit of difference, not a huge difference, but certainly if we start switching up depths or start sampling in the spring one year and the fall next year, things can change, and nutrient values differ, right? We did not, part of this update, touch Lyme recommendations, and so I'm really not going to talk about that, but suffice it to say that pH management is really one of the number one things that you all can do as a producer or as a consultant in terms of managing nutrient availability and all of the good things that happen in that soil that are, still remain quite a mystery to us. But microbial activity is highly influenced by pH and pH dynamics. And so pH management, we can't just say enough about how important that is in terms of raising a good corn and soybean crop. It's increasingly difficult to do that as our pHs stray away from what we would consider optimal. Okay. Talk about corn nitrogen rates. So we have a rate that kind of a nitrogen recommendation that we've adopted across the Corn Belt into a consistent framework of what that is. And so it's really a model that's, in some ways, it's really appropriate for what's happening right now with prices, grain prices, and fertilizer prices. And it's a very simple model, but it's focused on maximizing profitability and not yield. Okay. And so we call this a maximum return to nitrogen. And the idea is that for every pound, we understand that when we go out and we apply nitrogen in a cornfield, the first 50 pounds are going to give us the best return on investment. The next 50 pounds are going to give us the second best return on investment, meaning that we're going to get more yield or more bushel out of that first 50 pounds. And then that second 50 pounds, as we continue to increase the amount of nitrogen that we apply, every pound that we apply, we of course, that's a cost. And how much of that are we actually seeing some sort of return? And so the idea is, with this whole kind of big picture piece here, is that for every additional pound of nitrogen that we apply, we want to make sure that we're seeing some sort of net not gross, but net economic benefit to that. Okay, so that's really kind of the concept. Each state has its own recommendations from trials conducted within that state. And so with Ohio, we've got about 282 corn nitrogen rates, nitrogen rate trials that we've conducted over the last 15 years. That's a tremendous amount of work to do that. And we've actually been we've kind of continued to a lot of that work, and we've got about another 40 that we're going to add to our database in the next few months. And so this is ongoing work that we've been doing to try to really, we understand that nitrogen is very challenging, but just to really create a robust data set across the state and understanding how corn responds to nitrogen. Okay, so we can talk a little bit more about that. But this MRTN, or maximum return nitrogen tool, is a very simple tool. It asks you for very little, and it's a starting point for, it's not a final endpoint, but it's a starting point for a statewide recommendation. Okay, that tool can be found here. It's at a Iowa State website. There's some redevelopment that's happening. This link is likely going to change, but going to ohiostateagcrops.osu.edu or paying attention to the corn newsletter, if this does get moved, I'm sure it will get redirected to a new web address. If you go to that web address, you will see this is the primary web page, and what we need to input is a few things. It's the cost that you're paying for nitrogen fertilizer, and then you can put it in a $1 per pound or $1 per ton basis. This is obviously an outdated slide. It was a slide from last year, and it's outdated now. And the price that you're gonna expect to get for corn grain. Let me turn this to a laser pointer so maybe you can see a little bit better here. So the price of nitrogen fertilizer and the price we're going to get for corn grain, and then you've got to select the state in Ohio. Here's the number of trials that this database is based on, and you see that it spits out this recommended rate based on this. Okay, it's 180 pounds with this range of 164 to 196, and that's really where we believe that profitability will be maximized in that range. Okay, so let's break this down. What does this actually mean? So we can see this graph right here, and you'll get this. Excuse me, I'm getting an awesome message to update my computer, which I don't think I want to do right now. Okay, so the graph that we see is the return to nitrogen on this vertical axis in dollars per acre. And then this is our nitrogen rate in pounds N per acre. Okay, we can look at the green line, which is N fertilizer cost. Of course, that mostly increases linearly. If you apply 100 pounds, it's going to be half as much as if you apply 200 pounds, roughly, et cetera, et cetera. And then what we have is this blue line is a gross return to nitrogen. So gross, if we think about what that means, and from an economic perspective, that's how much total that you bring in. That does not include your costs of production. Okay, we know there's other costs besides nitrogen fertilizer. Of course, there's seed costs, there's diesel, there's all kinds of things. But nitrogen fertilizer represents a very real cost, a substantial cost in corn production. Okay, especially these days. So what does this do? It takes this gross return. Now this is a typical corn nitrogen response across these different trials. And then if we multiply that in terms of what we're going to get on a dollar per bushel basis, and then we subtract, so we take that blue line, that gross, we subtract this input cost, gross minus your input, and then you get the net, and that's the red line. That's what we focus on here. Okay, and so depending on how steep or shallow this green line is, that is nitrogen fertilizer, or how the dynamics of this, how high this goes, will really depend on what this red line is doing, and that's what we need to pay attention to. Okay, so again, we take our gross and we subtract our costs, and we get our net. And this, at this point, is when we maximize profitability. Now, here's the point, folks, right? Like we said, it's for every dollar. Does an additional pound of nitrogen actually yield you more profit? And what happens is that, we know that if we apply, say, 200 pounds or 250 pounds or 300 pounds, we might be able to squeak a few more bushels out. But is the extra cost of that end fertilizer paying for itself? And we can see that as that increase, as the dynamics between this blue line, the gross, and the inputs, that is, it's plateauing off, this blue line, and because of that, the red line starts to dip. Okay, so again, we're trying to find the optimization, or trying to maximize profitability, not productivity. And we know that those two things are closely related. But I tell you what, times like this, with prices as they are, they're not one and the same. Okay, and so it's just something that we really stress. We think it's a very important framework, especially with the variability of grain prices, of nitrogen fertilizer. These are things that we advocate, and it's been, this kind of model across 6 states has been run through the ringer. It's been tested a lot of different ways, and it's not perfect in any stretch, but there's a lot of worse things out there. And again, this is a starting point for a statewide recommendation. Okay, and so we encourage folks to use other pieces of information, tissue testing, or whatever that you might have available to them, whatever that you might use in your program to kind of refine and develop these rates. Okay, we can talk more about that. So again, this is a table that is a bit outdated because we're talking about 50 cent per pound nitrogen right now. We need a few more columns to really kind of round this out, but the concept is really what's more important here. When we have low fertilizer prices and high grain prices, our nitrogen rate increases. And when we have high fertilizer prices and low grain prices, our nitrogen rate decreases. And so it's very important in terms of what folks are paying for end fertilizer and what they're going to be paying this spring, to think about that. And that generally is going to, grain prices being relatively high and nitrogen prices being high. It's really, there's an interplay there, but we're typically seeing a reduction in recommended core nitrogen rate because of that, and that's driven by that price and fertilizer. All right, I'm going to stop with nitrogen and talk about P and K. I know I don't have too much time here, but talk a little bit about the framework. And in general, with phosphorus, potassium, we think about this very differently. Nitrogen, it's an annual nutrient. We apply nitrogen annually. P and K, we can think about this as a multiple year nutrient. And if we make an investment this year, that we might rely on that investment for multiple years moving forward. And likewise, assuming we've made that investment in years past, we're able to say, withdraw on that investment, say this year, the next couple of years with fertilizer prices where they are, and without much consequence. So we have a lot of evidence to suggest that. I just say that soils are very well buffered, and that if you have been kind of following a general build and maintenance framework, there's no reason to believe that taking a year off from fertilizing phosphorus and potassium is going to cause you any issues, assuming that your soil test levels are in a range that we recommend. Okay, and so I could walk you through this. Maybe I will just real briefly, but basically, as our soil test level, let's just take soil test P, as that increases, our fertilizer rate's basically going to decline and then drop off and go to 0. And when it's in the sweet spot between the critical level and the maintenance limit, this is really what we recommend and what we consider optimal. Okay, and so we'll talk. I'll give you some of these critical levels for P and K in a bit here. But I just want to talk about kind of maybe a little bit about the concept, and then how we got to revising these and thinking about. I would say we have good confidence in what we're recommending, because we've just revalidated everything with really extensive trials. Okay, so in other words, if we're in the sweet spot here, the recommendation is to apply essentially what you're removing, approximate. For potassium, it's a little bit more than you apply. For phosphorus, it is what you remove. If you're below this, we need to build the soil up. So we apply maintenance. In other words, how much we apply the amount of P2O5 or K2O that has been taken off in grain, and then a little bit extra to kind of move the soil test into the sweet spot, okay? And then the timing is important here. If we're below the critical level, it's deficient, we suggest applying fertilizer before you grow another crop. Whereas if you're above the critical level, this magical number that's of course not so magical, but it's a good frame of reference, apply sometime within that crop rotation. And if you're above maintenance limit, there's no real need to apply. You can if you want. We're not telling you that you can't, but we're just say that there's very, very, very little chance that you're going to see any economic benefit to that and any yield response when it's above here. We rarely see yield responses when soils are above the critical level, and the yield responses are to fertilizer are almost entirely when we're below that recommended critical level. Okay, so that's kind of how things work. And the numbers changed a little bit, but they primarily changed because we moved our extractants. We used to make recommendations in Bray phosphorus and ammonium acetate for potassium, calcium, magnesium. Those are two separate extractions, but soil testing labs have been using Malic 3 for at least 10 years commercially, as much as 15 or 20. So in some sense, we're making the recommendations consistent with what's commonly measured in soil testing labs. We did a bunch of work across a lot of different sites to look at the relationship between those two. They're highly related, but they're not the same. So there's conversion equations, but really Malic 3 phosphorus and potassium are the new standards, have been quote unquote the standards for some time now. I'm going to talk just a little bit about some of the P and K work that we've done. And it's going to include long-term trials and then these on-farm strip trials, okay? So, gosh, very briefly, I'm just going to mention 3 different trials that were started in 2006 before I got here, but Robert Mullen started these. We had 3 different rates of K fertilizer, P fertilizer, and a corn soybean rotation. And so just to show you a teeny bit of data from this, these are what we've got is our 3 trials in Northwest, Western, and Worcester, corn yields, soybean yields on bottom, and then our 3 fertilizer rates of 0, 1x, which is crop removal, and then 2 to 3x, which is double to triple crop removal rates, okay? And I show this because these red sites, these red dots, really literally have not received any phosphorus fertilizer across this. Here, this is the first 13 years of the study, okay? And we can see with some sites that that there is some trends in terms of seeing kind of consistent decreases with the unfertilized treatment. But for the most part, when we start in what we would consider the optimal or the maintenance range, the soils have capacity to supply fertilizer need for many years here, okay? So this is phosphorus trends. And then we can look at potassium as well. There are different graphs and different data. And here, interestingly, with this Western site, this is a Kokomo and Brookston silt loam CECs. This is in Clark County. CECs around, say, somewhere between 14 to 16, 17 CEC. These soils happen to be more responsive to potassium fertilizer. And we're seeing really, out of all these sites with P and K, consistent decreases with the unfertilized plots in soybeans primarily, but a little bit here in the latter years of corn. Now, again, this is essentially 9, 10, 8 years of not fertilizing at all and continually removing crop from those plots. And so, yeah, we would expect after that amount of time and the soil's drawing down that we're going to start seeing yield responses. But I like to show these data and this is just a kind of a real general kind of overview of it, just to show that, soils are capable when they're managed in that maintenance range of supplying nutrients for years, honestly, and because there's a reason for that, because soils are buffered and they change slowly over time, right? That's what we mean by buffering capacity. This idea that crops need to be spoon-fed and you need to put out nutrients and do foliar fertilization, we just really, it's not that we don't have any credence or stock in that. We think that when those types of practices make economic sense, it's in the minority of observations. We really don't see very, very little of that coming out in any of the data that we collect kind of from the collective piece of that. So again, when we are in maintenance range, soils have a capacity to provide nutrition to the crops for many years, okay, without fertilization. All right, I'm gonna talk a little bit about our on-farm strip trials. And we conducted trials for 5 years plus, and still a few more trickled in even after 2018, but the majority of that effort was about a 5-year period. This is something I would argue that really hasn't been done in Ohio before. We focused on corn, soybean, wheat. This was a trial funded by really commodity, Ohio Soybean Council and Ohio Corn and Wheat. And without those funds, this work really wouldn't have been possible, right? So we looked at NPK primarily and a little bit of sulfur. And the whole idea was to get as many diverse soils and regions and management practices, et cetera. So within this, we had people that were doing no-till, people that were plowing, people that were growing cover crops for 15 years, people that hadn't had a cover crop, there's all kinds of soils and management histories that intersect in this study, okay? We worked directly with growers, and I won't go to that. Let's just talk about a little bit of the results, okay? So for phosphorus, we had 102 trials over 5 years, 54 in corn and 48 in soybean. These are the soil test levels in Malic 3P. And how we look at this is that this is just essentially a distribution where all the trials, when we had most of the trials, which is represented by kind of the widest ribbon section of the ribbon right here, were in between these two dashed lines, which happen to represent the maintenance or the optimal region of what our recommendations are. So between what it means, and again, I haven't showed you this yet, but it's between 20 and 40 part per million malic phosphorus, which is the same as 40 to 80 pounds per acre of malic phosphorus, okay? But we also had a significant number of observations that were well above that optimal range. And so we look at a data set like this and we said, are we actually expecting to see a lot of yield increases? And the answer is really no, because these soils were for the most part in kind of that optimal soil test level or even above, okay? So there's a lot to be said of this data, and it's a lot of work. Randomized replicated strip trials, and here we're just taking big averages across all the trials. So across 54 corn trials, fertilizing ahead of time with phosphorus increased our average bushel per acre about 3.5 bushels fertilizing with phosphorus. And this was primarily about, typically, not always, but typically say 100 pounds of P2O5 that was applied spring broadcast. Okay, it's often what was happened. There was some that was put through the planter. There a lot of different variability in terms of how things were done. Some, of course, was fall applied, et cetera. But it ranged across all these 54 trials from we got a minus 20 bushel decrease to a plus 22 bushel increase, okay? And if we take this relative yield, which is just the ratio of fertilized versus unfertilized, it represented about a 2% decrease, a 98 relative yield, which is about a 2% decrease if we did not fertilize, okay? With soybeans, proportionally, it was about the same. It was a 1.3 bushel increase across all trials, and there's our range. Again, if we fertilized versus not, we had about a 2% decrease without the fertilization that occurred, okay? So really not huge responses in general to this, okay? And so then we can look at potassium. And potassium, we did have more observations that were kind of in what we would consider below the critical level or needing fertilization before a crop was grown. We had 81 on-farm strip trials across that, 33 in corn and 48 in soybean. Here's some of the averages that you can see. And here there was some interesting things, maybe a little bit more interesting that came out. And one is that when we fertilized with K, we got an average of about 4 bushel increase with K fertilization. But the range here in terms of magnitude of the increase was much greater. And that's what we've seen typically, that K, you can see really big differences. With phosphorus, they're not so dramatic. And so at one of our sites, we had a almost 60 bushel increase with K fertilization, okay? And then interestingly, and we're still trying to work some of this out, but for soybeans, we had 48 soybean trials. And across all those trials, applying K fertilizer decreased yields about a 0.5 bushel. And this is kind of interesting work that's taken place in a few other states. Minnesota is one of them, where they're seeing fairly subtle but consistent decreases in soybeans following potassium, spring applied potassium. And there's some thought, I mean, we don't really know a whole lot about this, but this is also shown in some of our long-term data. I didn't show any of that, but I could revisit that and just say that we're seeing some detrimental effects with, certainly we need KCl fertilizer, but with that, the thought is that soybeans are a little bit sensitive to the chloride and that salt in the potash fertilizer. And so we've seen an overall, an average decrease in K, okay? Sorry, in an average decrease in yields based on K fertilization, okay? But again, the range here is much, much smaller than we saw with corn. All right, so what does that mean? Well, that means that a couple of take-home points here. One is that soils are highly buffered and they can provide fertility needs over multiple growing seasons if required. And the second thing is that these on-farm trials across a whole diversity of different sites really underscore that when soils are in those recommended ranges, the chances of seeing yield responses are not very good. And the chances of seeing a really significant yield response is very low. This, as an example, this nearly 60 bushel increase occurred in a field with a malic potassium of about 60. So it was very, very low in K. And because of that, not surprisingly, we see a large response with fertilization. In some sense, this talk, I'm not spending a lot of time trying to convince you of exactly how we got the information, but I can just say that this is all a very data-driven exercise, and we conducted, literally hundreds of trials. And so these are our new recommendations in terms of malic. So 20 to 40 pounds part per million for malic P if you're growing corn and bean. If you have wheat or alfalfa in the rotation, that slides it up. We've confirmed that wheat and alfalfa need greater phosphorus requirements, especially when they're growing in those cooler soils with low P mineralization rates. Another kind of bit of a major change that we did is that instead of scaling our critical value based on CEC, which was done at kind of a continuous scale, we've just simplified this because we did not find any justification for that. So we have sandy soils, less than 5 mil equivalent per 100 grams CEC. 100 to 130, that's our optimal range for those soils. And for basically all others, 120 to 170 part per million. These are in part per million. If you multiply these numbers by 2, you essentially get the pound per acre equivalent, okay? So we did a bunch of work with grain nutrient removal rates. I'm gonna skip over this. The main take home here is that between our 1995 tri-state and our new data, which was based on literally thousands of observations, we see pretty remarkable decreases in grain nutrient concentration, and particularly with potassium. So that's an important finding. Means that for every bushel that is being removed from a field, there's actually less K2O in that than there was, say, 25, 30 years ago. And so that has implications for what we're fertilizing, okay? And our recommendations have been updated based on that. And then I'll just talk about, because it's an interest to a lot of folks, a lot of chatter about sulfur. And we've are kind of on the tail ends of compiling a bunch of trial information. We've got whatever this adds up to be, relatively around 100 different trials, again, mostly on farm replicated trials in corn, bean, and wheat that we've conducted as a OSU extension over the last, say, I think the first trial here is in 2013, so close to 10 years. And we just don't see a lot of, we can see at all these trials that we've added sulfur. We see some increases, a little bit of in-furrow burning with iosulfate, too much salt, or even as a starter. And we just are not seeing a lot of observations. So there's a lot of chatter, a lot of interest in sulfur. We just, in our trials that we've conducted, haven't seen it. We can compare that with some work in Indiana in looking at early planted crops, especially soybeans, being more likely to be responsive than, say, what would be considered quote unquote normal planted, whatever that means these days. But sometime, say, in May, most of these, late April, early May, these trials would have been planted typically. All right. So to summarize our recommendations, most things have been updated. Corn nitrogen rates, our framework, our extractant, but in some ways things are different, in some ways they're not so much. So our P and K critical levels in the framework really is mostly the same. It's now based on Malic 3, okay? So we've got good confidence, folks, in terms of the numbers that we've put out and the work that we've done. It's a tremendous amount of effort. A lot of this was on Ohio State University county educators and private crop consultants ran a lot of trials. And I think we've got a lot of great data to kind of stand behind the recommendations that we have. So I'm just going to end there, acknowledge again, check off dollars at work, and would be happy to take any questions that folks might have.
Thanks, Steve. We do have 3 questions in the Q&A. The first one is, does your nitrogen rate calculator figure in nitrogen loss? And does it figure in nitrogen stabilizers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a great question. For our calculator, the general assumption is that good nitrogen practices were used, right? So it's not going all out and broadcasting and not incorporating urea on March 15th and just hoping that it's still there by the time, when we go to plant. And so there's a lot of different ways that nitrogen was, the types, nitrogen sources and the placement and the timing of that, but it does not account for losses. So as an example, we know that that's a really challenge. It's a big challenge for nitrogen fertilizer and management of fertilizer. And we definitely have trials in our database that were subject to high losses, and we still report those. We don't throw trials out if it was a really wet, June, or a really wet, say, May or something like that. Even if it was late planted, we still include those. We believe it represents what would be considered a realistic on-farm experience of what happens and what corn does, in response to that. So, but the underlying assumption for the most part is that it's good nitrogen management. Stabilizers, most of these trials likely did not have stabilizers included, but some of them certainly did. So I would say it's probably less than 10% of the trials in our database, but that's an important consideration. And of course, when we use, some nitrogen stabilizer, we become less concerned about losses, and maybe it's an insurance policy of that the nitrogen is going to be there. But again, as a general tool, as a statewide tool, there's a lot of nuance in nitrogen that we can all appreciate that's really not captured in a simplified tool like this, and really can't be without asking you about 100 different questions before we give you an N rate, right? A recommended N rate. And that's, we're just not there yet. There's just a lot of site specificity with nitrogen fertilizer, and then the weather and the interactions. There's just, it's damn complicated. We all can appreciate that. So those are great considerations though. Yep.
The second question is, with all of the cash rented ground out in the country now, most growers don't over apply fertilizers anymore. How would your test results look with low P and K soil test levels and fall applied versus spring applied?
Yeah, great questions. There's a lot of rented ground, it's true. And, it depends on how that's managed. We, ask for low testing fields, and the people that, for 5 years, we asked, hey, if you've got a low testing field, we'd love to work with you and run trials. Most of the growers that came forward to work with us were on fields that, the fertility was managed well. And so we believe that if we had more fields in our study that were really low testing, we would have seen more yield responses. And I think that we had enough to span that we have a lot of confidence, right? It's not that we had no low testing fields. It's not that we had everything was high, everything was low, et cetera. But we just feel confident that critical level is not a perfect immutable number, but it's a good recommended average, right? And it's 20 part per million for phosphorus. So if you're at 18, are you going to see a yield response if you fertilize? Well, no, that's certainly not guaranteed. Or if you're at 22 or 25, are you guaranteed not to see any bump if you apply fertilizer? Well, no, but it's again, it's a generalized recommendation. So the last question, or the last piece of that question, Stephanie, was about, remind me.
So in those fields with low P and K soil test levels, fall applied versus spring applied?
Right, yeah. So P and K timing, nitrogen timing is very important for phosphorus and potassium. We have not looked extensively at that. Most all of our trials were spring applied. Those long-term trials I mentioned very briefly were all fall applied. Again, we just, that has been looked at with work done a long time ago, right? There's been a lot of kind of P and K timing work that was done in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and in Ohio as well. And the summary of all of that work is that it doesn't matter. That's what, if you apply for P or K in the spring or the fall, in a general sense, it doesn't have a big impact in terms of nutrient availability. Now, we know that P and K fixation happen, and we know when soil test levels are really low and we apply fertilizer, that fixation rates are going to be higher. So in those scenarios, when you're going into, say, a rented field and it's very low fertility, I might be inclined to apply a spring application relative to a fall. But more importantly than that, I would probably be running fertilizer as a starter or through the planter. So we know that we have a concentrated source that the crop's going to see instead of maybe a broadcast application. So if that's helpful, I don't know.
And then the last question is, have you done any work with zinc? And if soils are low in zinc, how much would it increase yields?
Yeah, we did some work to compile kind of all the micronutrient studies. Admittedly, some of it's dated work, but it's still work that's been done in Ohio. And, we know that there's a lot of people, a lot of growers that talk about zinc in, particularly in corn production. We have done micronutrient trials. We've conducted probably a couple dozen of them, and we've had very limited success finding differences. It's a little bit frustrating because we know that micronutrient response can be very patchy within a field, and laying out strips and trying that, you often don't see responses blanketly across the field. And so that's some of the challenge. The other challenge is that Malic 3 zinc is not a great, it's just not a very good indicator of zinc availability. It's not a good diagnostic tool. It's the one that everyone uses and we think about. I'm not saying it's meaningless, but it's not, a great tool to say if we apply zinc, we're gonna get a response or we're not gonna get a response. And so in general, my stance has been, we just don't have a lot of evidence to show that zinc fertilization is, a major tool or a major part of profitable corn production or soybean production. But there's, of course, many folks that would argue with me on that. We just have not seen it. And it's just really hard to generate data that shows that we see any sort of consistency in not just zinc, but micronutrients. Where we do see micronutrient response is manganese and high pH soils. That's the most consistent micronutrient response, manganese and high pH soils, particularly with soybeans, and in low organic matter soils. Those are typically the places that you're going to see it. But yeah, it's a challenge. I don't have a great recommendation, except that there's a lot of, in my opinion, a lot of other ways that we can manage fields and holistically soil fertility. Going out and applying a little bit of micronutrient is a pretty easy thing, but the whole kind of holistic farm management and soil management piece, which will likely do a lot more things for nutrient availability, I would say is a much bigger hammer than, applying a few pounds of zinc in starter fertilizer or whatever it might be. Yeah.